Okay, share some tips in studying for the AP Lit exam. Yeah. Come to Fiveable. But no, I think I definitely am trying to set up streams so that it feels like studying. I think practice is really the best way to study. I think that there are like Quizlets out there that you could practice terms, like memorize terms, but I think that's far less useful than practice reading and analyzing, figuring out what you think about the people and the relationships. I don't know if that's what you were looking for, but I think I definitely want to present opportunities that feel like studying. This is such a singular year. There are so many things that are specific about this year that it's changing the way that I can even talk about it. But I think it's almost guaranteed. I shouldn't say almost guaranteed. It's very likely that the passage that you'll see on the exam in a few weeks is going to be about analyzing some sort of relationship or characterization of something. And so I think even when you're watching TV, watching movies, to just kind of use those as characters as practice for figuring out how the author, director, whoever, how they set up characters and how they showed you who the characters are, and how their language creates that. I think that's the best study. And then, like, as much as possible, have those conversations with other people, see what they saw and what you missed and what they missed, that kind of thing. Reread everything that all the short prose that you've been given. If you had short stories in your class or whatever, reread those and look for, even if you weren't looking for it previously, look for characters and relationships, attitudes, that kind of thing. So let's get into some practice. Follow Think Fiveable. Tonight I'm talking about setting and characterization. A little bit of setting as characterization, but just thinking about the kinds of things that you want to remember when you are reading a prose passage, things related to, and you're trying to analyze setting and or characterization. Again, the likelihood that you will be analyzing some sort of relationship is very strong, and a few of those have been about setting. So just some review terms to remember when you're writing about setting, just so you can use the language of setting, and then some review terms for characterization, a couple sample paragraphs just to analyze for those two things, looking at prompts, and then looking at setting and character together, how setting impacts characterization and how they work together to make meaning. And that'll be the night. So first, setting. Again, this is not a new idea. We know that setting is the time and the place of the passage, but we also want to think that as the College Board phrases it, there we go. Now it's going to go. Yeah. Okay. So as the College Board phrases it, setting, this is the setting standard, one of the setting standards. Setting includes the social, cultural, and historical situation during which the events of the text occur. So remembering that you will probably be told on the exam when the passage was published. You might be told when it is set. And so those sorts of things help you kind of put the passage in context. You can know something about that time. And so that will help you know about the social, cultural, and historical situation. For example, if it's in the 19th century, you know what the expectations were, you know how people were dressing, you know if it's American or it's British, that sort of thing can help you place a context around the text. And that's going to help you not only figure out how characters fit into the setting, but also which characters are ironic for the setting or breaking social norms, that sort of thing. And so then that will help you analyze the character, because it will help you know that, he or she is brave or courageous or willing to be an outsider, that sort of thing. So questions to consider when you see when the book is set or when the book was written. And I think it's appropriate to assume that if they give you the publication date, but they don't give you any indication that it's set differently, then you could assume that the publication is the setting as well, the time or the year rather. And so that era, whatever it is. So think about what you know about that time, what was going on in the world at that time. If you know if you know that it is an American author, you can think about, you know, everything that you learned in U.S. history about whatever that era is or period. And then also, what were the norms, expectations, and acceptable behaviors? Because again, you want to be prepared for a character to either fit into the setting or to be on the fringes or margins of the setting and be able to incorporate that into your analysis. You're also thinking about the global or national region. You're thinking about, is the setting urban or rural, and what does that mean for the character? What time of year it is, because that establishes there's some symbolism behind different times of the year. We know that spring is a time of rejuvenation. We know that summer is a time that is very bright and very warm, usually, depending on where you are in the world. But that there's an indication that the events of the story may follow the events of the year. And so you might expect on an Easter-based story, you might expect there to be some sort of rejuvenation or refreshment or, revitalization of something returning, that sort of thing. All the things that start with RE, right? Everything coming back, because that's the implication of spring. Whereas on the other hand, if it's in the fall, there could be a harvest sort of situation, something coming to fruition, or on the other hand, something on its way out toward winter. Winter usually is implying a cold, a death, a separation, a distancing. Things are going to be not emotion laden, maybe. So all of that plays into how you are able to read the passage and what you expect to see. Also, if something goes between seasons, then that passing of time is also significant. And then any cultural significance, again, Easter is different than a regular Sunday. The time of day is very similar to the time of year, where the middle of the day, like noon, is going to be like summer. So everything is high and it's biggest and it's warmest, whereas nighttime is like dark, as winter is like cold. So thinking about all these things that you are given, and whether or not they apply or whether they're subverted. So having those predictions. So for example, this is a passage from an older American novel. And it's just thinking about how setting is established and how mood is established through setting. Mood matters. It's not something that you are often asked to analyze because mood is a reader interpretation, but sometimes it impacts the events of the story, right? It's like foreshadowing. You are able to understand what you're going to expect based on the way that the author describes the setting. And so we know that some things are just particularly foreboding, or if you've ever read, Edgar Allan Poe, he doesn't really write stories that happen in the middle of the day, in the middle of the summertime. Like, they're not joyous, and so they're not in well-lit, large windowed rooms where the air comes in and the sun shines on everything and everything is well lit. That doesn't match the goings on of his stories. It doesn't match the tension. So, for example, it took only 15 or 20 years for the wooden jail to take on water stains and other signs of age, which darkened its already gloomy appearance. So if you look at something like this, it's already in a jail, right? So we have this sense of confinement. We have a sense of trappedness. That's not really a word, but entrapment. We know that it's not going to be very free, and then it's already gloomy, and we're using words that are talking about things that darken it. And so it's getting darker and darker, which we know gives a mood that's going to either establish suspense or sadness, right? Some sort of gloom or sullen. The rest on the door was iron spikes. So there's a little bit of paradox there, that everything is old already, even though they're in the new world. And the idea that they're calling it the new world tells you around when this is either written or set. Like all things touched by crime, it seemed that the prison had never been young or new. In front of the prison, there was a grassy area overgrown with weeds, which must have found something welcoming in the soil that had supported the black flowers of society. So here we have a little bit of a complexity. We have a little bit of a juxtaposition of the prison getting older and darker, whereas the grassy area is growing, but even the growing is too much. So it's overrun by weeds, which means that the nature is taking over a little bit in the same way that the rust and the water are taking over. So it's not really in charge. The building's not in charge, which means people are not in charge, which also implies something about the nature of the people. So they call them the black flowers of society. So that's something that implies that nature is the stronger power here. Even the people are being compared to the nature. But on one side of the ugly prison door, there was a wild rose bush, which was covered with delicate buds on this June day. So again, June is a very, there are some implications of joy. There are some implications of freedom and play, right? So this red rose bush is sitting in front of this dark and gloomy building. And so that starts to give you an implication. Also, the color red is very passionate. So it's, it's important that it's a red rose bush. I'm sorry, a wild rose bush. And so we have this sort of implication again of nature taking over, but also this kind of nature versus the kind that makes things dark and ugly. It was as if nature had taken pity and offered some beauty to the criminals walking in to serve their terms or heading out to face their executions. Right. So just in this way, we're looking at how mood is established. And so we have these two big ideas. We have this huge idea about the darkness of the jail, the rust on the spikes, everything aging and getting worse and worse. But then also this idea that as the weeds grow and as the wild roses grow, that it's getting better. So there's this kind of glimmer of hope among all the darkness. And so we're going to see, whether or not that plays out. Like this is a novel, so we would keep that in the back of our heads as we read the novel. But even in a shorter passage, we're seeing that this wild rose bush represents the rose bush and the jail represent these two sides of nature, and that there's an over looming gloom, but also that we're able to have moments of brightness, moments of even joy, perhaps. And so then it goes into more about the rose bush. This rose bush, by strange chance, has been kept alive in history, but whether it had merely survived out of stern old wilderness so long after the fall of gigantic pines and oaks that originally overshadowed it, or whether, as there is fair authority for believing, it had sprung up under the footsteps of the sainted Anne Hutchinson as she entered the prison door, we shall not take upon us to determine. And so if you know Anne Hutchinson, then you know that this is Salem and that witches are going into this prison. And so that's a whole other thing. Whether the witches are like the roses and they're a bright, joyous spot, or they are the downfall of the entire society remains to be seen. So this is from the Scarlet Letter. So that's useful. But I just wanted to give an example of how setting can impact. So again, knowing the time and place. So if you had known that this was written or set in that time, then you would also have some predictions about the way that, Puritans would be more likely to be strict and not joyous. Like they're not necessarily enjoying the scent or sight of a wild rose bush because they just weren't focused on the joys of nature as much as the very narrow parameters of their theocracy. So that's why I gave that example. Questions, thoughts about what that looks like, why we care, how I saw it, where it went. All right. So that's setting. That's how setting is established. That's how we want to be able to look at it and read about it. We're always looking for patterns of language. And so again, to see all that darkness, all the different ways to write about darkness and aging, gives us some implication of where that's going. So then characterization, again, we know that characterization is how characters are created. We pay attention to what they do and say, just like we would in real life. That characters can be static or dynamic, that you were always looking for a protagonist or an antagonist. And that also, because we're talking about setting this week, thinking about how setting can be an antagonist to a protagonist, or it can be a protagonist itself, or a character. It can be a foil. It can show who the character is. There are all sorts of ways that setting functions, and you might be asked to analyze some of that function. Again, direct characterization is what happens usually in the beginning and in the exposition of a fairly rigorous novel or a novel of literary merit. And so what the author tells the reader is usually less important than what the author doesn't tell the reader. And so the work that you're doing is inferring based on the more subtle types of characterization. So you're probably going to be asked to analyze a relationship or a character's attitude about another character, or even the impact of a character on another. Those have, well, I shouldn't say you probably, but those have been the previous prompts in the last few years, as we'll look at in a moment. And so you want to think about what you can tell about one character by the way that they talk about another. And so this example is from Othello. And just really quickly, Iago, who we all know if we've read the play, we know that Iago to be a villain, but Iago talks a lot. And Iago, Shakespeare uses soliloquies and asides to show us who Iago is, and also to show us how that progresses and how other people see him and how he sees other people. And so there are a couple little speeches. The one on the left, he says, "Thus do I ever make my fool my purse." And so that right there tells you how he feels about this other character. And so when you take that in juxtaposition with what he actually says to the character, that reveals a lot about Iago, and much more about Iago than it does about Cassio, who he's talking about. So that's just an example there. He calls Cassio a proper man in that fifth line on the left. And so we know that he has interpreted Cassio as a proper man, and so knows that that's going to make him a better mark, for lack of a better word, a better target. But also to know that that's the way he thinks about people, that the better you are, the more useful you are to him, and also the more gullible you will be and vulnerable to his wiles, tells you about him. And so we don't care as much about what we learn about Cassio through Iago's speech, but we care more about what we learn about Iago by the way he talks about people. And so then the one on the right is very similar, him making fun of Othello for being good and for being of a, quote, free and open nature that thinks men honest. And so he's just kind of ugly. You know, he's kind of the worst of human nature, but it is useful to pay attention to how he talks about good people, because it's not that he doesn't understand what good is. And it's not that he doesn't make that comparison between them and him. Often he knows. And so this helps us see who he is. So that's just a kind of starter for being able to interpret relationships by how a character reacts to others around him, how a character speaks to others around him, and also any complexity that you find between the way that that character speaks and the way that the character thinks. So if we're able to get into the mind, then we can see the complexity between the inner and outer expressions of that person. So here's just a few of the last few prose analysis prompts that have talked about setting and characterization together. Starting at the bottom. So 2009 was very clearly a relationship between setting. It says, analyze how Petrie establishes Ludi Johnson's relationship to the urban setting. And so that was very clearly setting. It was very sorry, it was very time and place, and the way that the air actually felt around Moody Johnson, the wind felt around Moody Johnson more than it was about the cultural setting. But then in 2013, setting played a role. And so this was an interesting prompt because the background given told you that it was in rural England during the late 19th century, which is important. And so I started thinking about a whole lot of pastoral settings, but it really, it was very non-urban. And so you have to think about women in the 19th century in England, period, and where they were and what they'd be doing. But the difference between a woman in London and a woman in a rural area, I don't know what it's called, but wherever you were. And so it was a farming community. And so what the expectations of that woman would be played a role. And so that's a very much an example of how a cultural and historical situation plays a role in your ability to analyze a character. So an interesting thing about that prompt was you were asked to analyze or characterize the woman and her situation. And so I think that they didn't want to give a whole lot of information. They didn't want to lead students in a particular direction. But I think that's a really interesting one to figure out what is the situation and how do I talk about it. So that's a good practice prompt. In 2015, it was an American, fairly recent novel, 1986, I think. And Louise Erdrich is a Native American writer. And so that was the impact of the environment on the two children. And so then you just have to figure out what is the environment? How do I write about the environment? And then how do I figure out how the environment has impacted the two children? And then 2017 was a really interesting one. It was a little bit about setting in that cultural historical way. It was written in the 1700s. And so the question, the background that was given was that Mr. Pickle, so if you've seen any of the memes, there are a lot of memes about this prompt, Peregrine Pickle. But Mr. Pickle encounters the brother of his beloved Amelia. And then you're asked to consider how the two men confront their own uncontrolled emotions and yet attempt to abide by their social norms. And that's a very intricate sentence. There are a lot of things to pick up and think about. And you have to think, what are the social norms of the 18th century? Right? So you have to know that in the first place. You have to think about what they would be asked to do, and the idea that the social norm would not be to give in to your uncontrolled emotions. That the expectation would be that your emotions would remain controlled, and so they're trying to abide by that social norm, and that's implied, right, in that sentence. That there's a conflict between uncontrolled emotions and social norms. But I think that's the kind of thing where you would have to really think about, what do I know? What do I see? Because a prediction is going to be a little bit important in order to know. You have to have an idea of what those social norms are in order to know how they're in contrast to their emotions. So then the next part is to analyze how the task is to analyze how the author explores the complex interplay between emotions and social propriety, which is the same idea, right? That they are, that these men, the brother and the lover of Amelia, are struggling, right? There's an implication of a struggle between what they really want to do and what they're supposed to do as gentlemen, as people, as 18th century men. So any of those are about setting in some way, whether it's physical setting or cultural situation or both. The 2013, the rainbow, it's really about both. It's about where she actually is and what her environment is. So those are just things to think about. Again, if you're thinking about how do I study, to look at the prompts that have been and to try to respond to them is really useful. Even if you don't look at exemplars. But also there are practice prompts in the Fiveable community. If you respond to them, if they haven't been closed, if you respond to them, I will look at them and give you feedback and score them using the language of the rubric. Sort of unrelated question, but what is College Board expecting when we are writing these essays if we're only given 25 minutes? Well, you're given 45 minutes. So I don't know if that feels very comforting. But College Board knows that this is basically a rough draft. It understands that you are writing under a time situation, that you have to, that in the time that you're given, and maybe that's how you got to 25 minutes, that you're in the time that you're given, you're asked to look at the prompt, read the prompt fairly closely, more closely than you read most prompts, I would say, to figure out what it is that you've been asked to do, but also figure out what it is that you know going in. And so they know that you have to read the prompt, read the passage. No, that's fine. So this is given, you're given 45 minutes this year. In an average year, you're given 3 essays in 120 minutes. So that's, 40-ish minutes. So it's really not that much of a difference. It's just singling it down to one passage. So I think that it is important to know that they think it's going to be a rough draft. I do think that you should allow time to just read what you said. So not a whole lot of time. You're not trying to revise, but you are trying to make sure that you've said what you meant. You are trying to make sure that your sentences make sense if you, kind of lost your way a little bit. But they do know that this is not, you haven't had a process, this is not a process-based essay where you sit down and you brainstorm and you outline and you write and you revise and you edit and you maybe have somebody look at it and then you write it again. They know that that's not the case. And so what they're looking for is to know that you are capable of reading through the lens of the task, because that's important. I think that's one of the most important practice steps that you can take, is to read through the lens of the task. And so, for example, any of these, if you were looking and you say, characterize the woman in her situation in 2013, well, then you know that anything that's not directly related to the woman in her situation, you're looking for the situation, and the situation may come in the beginning, middle, or end of the text, like your understanding of her situation, but you know that you're only looking for it. And so anything that's not directly related to her situation or directly related to even her characterization, right, is not going to be as important, because you can really get caught up in the smaller devices that you notice, but not everything that you notice is worth an annotation or even remembering. And so I think that's what they're looking for, to know that you're able to understand the task that you are asked to complete, and that you are able to read through the lens of that task and then organize those, whatever you catch or notice, organize that into an essay. So they're looking for organization. They're looking for your argument to be supported. They're looking for you to make an argument. That's why the thesis is its own point this year and forward. They're looking to know that you know how to make a literary analysis argument, and that you know how to support it with significant evidence. The evidence that you choose matters, because you should only choose evidence that you can analyze, because it doesn't matter enough for you to note significant evidence and say, oh, this is related to the situation, if you can't establish what the situation is, if you haven't established what the situation is, and you can't connect it to the situation. So they're looking for you to have a strong thesis that implies that you have a roadmap, and then to support that thesis with every sentence that you have, either in the evidence that you've selected, or the commentary that you create, whatever is appropriate for your sentences. So, I think it's important to make sure that you know kind of the language of the rubric, that they're looking for a ratio of evidence and commentary, that they're looking for you to have created commentary that connects the evidence to the prompt, that they're looking for an essay that is organized around your own argument. That idea of a line of reasoning is very important. So for you to be able to establish, I keep going back to this 2013, but for you to establish in your introduction who the woman is and what her situation is, for example, and not say who the woman is or what the situation is, but to be able to actually characterize, actually have analyzed and have an argument. This is a this is not really applicable, but this is a lonely, scared woman who is in a situation that prevents her from moving forward, right? You make those statements, you establish that argument. This is who I see. This is what I see the woman to be and her situation to be. And then I'm going to show you where I found that along the way. So I think that's not an unrelated question at all. I think that's exactly what they're expecting, is for you to have found the answer and support it. I think they're not looking for a super long essay. They know that by the time you start writing and really get into the flow, you will be no less than 10, 15 minutes into your 45, right? You have to read. Maybe you're a fast reader, maybe you're not, but you're reading, looking for evidence. You don't even know what the evidence is until you have read halfway through it. So they're expecting that you figure out what the argument should be, make the argument. Because I think a lot of what happens is that students misread the task in the first place, and then you're responding to a prompt that doesn't exist. And so that throws you off in the first place. You might write a decent essay, but it's not effective in answering the prompt because you're writing about something else. So making sure that you know what the prompt says, making sure that every piece of evidence that you've noticed actually applies, and also noting that not every device you see is important to responding to the prompt. That there may be beautiful metaphors, but if they're not specific to the argument that you've created and the task that you've been asked for, then it doesn't matter. So I think that's the long version of the question, but they are expecting a rough draft. And the advice that they give readers every year is reward students for what they did well. So they're looking to give you points for what went right, not take away points for what didn't quite make it. So in that way, it's kind of the opposite. I always talk about, like, when you are competing in gymnastics, they take away little points for the mess ups the mistakes you make, the errors you have. But this is not like that in the same way. You're building. So you can only win, right? It's set up for you to win because it's rewarding you for doing well, as opposed to ticking you for doing poorly, or not poorly, but having more area for growth. I don't know if that answers your question. I hope that it does. They're looking for a rough draft that has an argument. They're looking to know that you have read it, but also that you read it appropriately, that you interpreted it in a way that makes sense. Good. You can't help if you misinterpret. Like, that's not something, you're not going to misinterpret on purpose. But just, to make sure that whatever you see can be supported. I like to tell students there are a lot of ways to be right? So we don't all have to agree. And another thing that I like to remind students is that because you are in this timed situation, like, don't spend time trying to figure out what everybody else is writing about and like trying not to write that, because that's not the point. The point is not to be different. The point is to be accurate and insightful. So the more time you spend about where can I take this thing that I've seen, where can I take this interpretation, how can I write about this interpretation, that's where you want to spend your time, not how can I see it differently than everybody else. So that's just the thing sometimes people get caught up in. Okay, so tonight, I want to look at the story of an hour. If you have read it, that's great. If you haven't, that's okay too. I am going to put a link to Story of an Hour in the call to action. So you can definitely read the whole thing some other time, and really practice looking at the relationship between the protagonist and her environment. But I want to pull out a couple paragraphs just so you see how that might work. And again, just practice like looking at the relationship between setting and characterization. So Story of an Hour was written by Kate Chopin. It was written in 1894. So just think about who people are in 1894. Kate Chopin is American, but you don't have to know that. It doesn't matter. Think about who people are, what the expectations were for people, how people were moving around in the late 19th century, what the world was. You know, people were still a little maybe prim, you know, the expectation. But this was also kind of a romantic period in terms of writing. So how people wrote about things, how people what kind of imagery was used was in a particularly flowery place. So if you haven't ever learned about like literary periods, I used to teach them. I don't really anymore. So don't feel like, oh, why didn't my teacher tell me that? But if you have learned about literary periods and how people were writing at different points in literary history, then that's something that you can apply to when you're reading, thinking about what you might expect the writing to look like. So, Story of an Hour is the story of 1 hour. It all takes place in an hour. It's not a long story, but I don't even have the whole thing right here. Again, that's in the link down below in that direction. But I just want to look at a few paragraphs and think about how, again, the relationship that's created between the protagonist's development and her environment. So again, thinking about a dynamic character, how they develop, what we find out about them, how they change from the beginning to the end, or how our understanding of them changes from the beginning to the end. Those are all relevant. So we're going to come in toward the end of the beginning is where we're coming in. But again, like you're not going to get a whole story on the exam, so I didn't feel like we needed to practice with the whole story. And so we're reading this and we're thinking, first of all, how does the character develop and what is the setting's symbolism? So in these 4 paragraphs here, just what are we seeing about the woman? As we read, what are we learning about her? How is she developing as a person in front of our eyes? And then also, what is any symbolism you see in the setting, which is time, place, climate, day, season, all of that. Like any symbolism you might see that I just talked about earlier or that you know about, period. So she did not hear this story as many women have heard the same, with the paralyzed inability to accept its significance. She wept at once, with sudden wild abandonment in her sister's arms. When the storm of grief had spent itself, she went away to her room alone. She would have no one follow her. There stood, facing the open window, a comfortable, roomy armchair. Into this she sank, pressed down by a physical exhaustion that haunted her body and seemed to reach into her soul. She could see in the open square before her house the tops of trees that were aquiver with the new spring life. The delicious breath of rain was in the air. In the street below, a peddler was crying his wares. The notes of a distant song which someone was singing reached her faintly, and countless sparrows were twittering in the eaves. There were patches of blue sky showing here and there through the clouds that had met and piled one above the other in the west facing her window. So if you want to take a moment and think about the answers to those questions just in these 4 paragraphs, how is the character developing? What is she doing? What kind of person is the author showing her to be? And then what's going on in the setting, both inside and outside? What do we see that might have some meaning beyond its literal? If you are watching a replay, take a pause, write it down, read it again, and then I'll share my own thoughts. Okay, so there are two things happening at once. We're learning about this woman, and we're also learning about what's happening around her. And so she hears, so just the idea that it starts off with this idea that she's not doing what most women would do, and that what she is doing is weeping with wild abandonment. And so I think that huge expression of emotion is something that women weren't supposed to, like they were expected but not supposed to. If that's the thing, like women at that time were, everybody said that they were so emotional, but they weren't supposed to express it because that made them weak. And she's not worried about that. So that sets her apart from her contemporaries in that way. She weeps with wild abandonment in her sister's arms, and then she spins that, and then she goes, and it's called a storm of grief, which is also the diction of outside. And so in the house, she's wild, she's stormy, she's different, she's exhausting, like severe weather, right? The kind of severe weather you would probably see. Well, in the South, it would be like a summer thing, actually, thunderstorms and that sort of thing, spring, summer. But then outside of her house, once she settles into this comfortable armchair, so she's taking up a lot of room in a lot of ways. And so that's a really interesting kind of diction choice that Kate Chopin has made, that she falls into this armchair that is not going to, limit her. So she's bigger than her, the expectations of her. She's bigger than her abandonment is wild. Her grief is stormy. Her chair is big. So everything is just like taking up room. She's a big presence. And so, but then outside she sees the trees that are quiver with new spring life. And so again, when we know that something is set in the spring, we expect there to be something new happening. We expect something to be blooming, something to be returning, something to have that kind of fresh greenness about it, or flowers opening up, like this sort of thing. And so inside, there's gloom that is huge, like this pall of sadness that's not just deep and quiet, though it's wild. And then outside we've got springtime, and so it's kind of the darkness inside, the big darkness inside, and then the fresh brightness outside. And so that's something that's juxtaposed here. And so if we talk about the relationship, right, in this way, she's not reflecting the outside whatsoever, but she is looking out at it and noticing it. She's noticing the breath of rain, which is a completely different kind of rain than her storm, right? It's a breath. It's not a gust. It's not a storm. And so it's lighter. It's fresher than what's going on inside. A peddler is out there bringing people to him. There's a song someone's singing, and sparrows in the eaves. And so everything outside is very light, very fresh, very, there's a levity to it, right? It's bright and light. And then there are patches of blue sky. The clouds inside are humongous and dark. The clouds outside are patchy and only carrying a breath of rain. So that's what I saw. So the symbolism there is about the time of the year. It's a springtime, but it's also the weather outside, but also the weather diction that's used to describe her in that storm, in the wildness. And so she's a thunderstorm, but outside there's a cleansing kind of storm. I mean, not storm, but a cleansing kind of rain, right? It's going to clean everything up. So as we move forward, then we're looking at how that continues, how we continue to learn about the two of them, she in the setting, the woman in the setting. And so the question guiding this is, what is the relationship? Again, so that's the prompt question. What's the relationship between the character and the setting? So she sat with her head thrown back upon the cushion of the chair, quite motionless, except when a sob came up into her throat and shook her, as a child who has cried itself to sleep continues to sob in its dreams. She was young with a fair, calm face whose lines bespoke repression and even a certain strength. But now there was a dull stare in her eyes, whose gaze was fixed away off yonder on one of those patches of blue sky. It was not a glance of reflection, but rather indicated a suspension of intelligent thought. There was something coming to her, and she was waiting for it fearfully. What was it? She did not know. It was too subtle and elusive to name, but she felt it, creeping out of the sky, reaching toward her through the sounds, the scent, the color that filled the air. So now the insight is coming in. So those things that she just saw out yonder, away off yonder, they're coming in. They're creeping out of the sky. They're creeping into her, not only her room through the window, but also into her soul. And so that freshness is starting to come and break up her thunder. And so this is the relationship between the character and the setting. As the character develops, she's taking in the lightness of the outside. She's lightening up as it comes to her. So that heavy, full storm that she was with the abandonment, and even when it comes back and shakes her, we've reached the eye of this storm because she's motionless, right? So she becomes very still, which gives the outside, the springtime, a chance to come and break up her heavy storm. And then the last piece, then I'll summarize. I'll take out the important parts. She's starting to kind of feel something coming toward her. It says beginning to recognize this thing that was approaching to possess her. And she was trying to beat it back with her will, but she lets it go. She abandoned herself a little. A whispered word escaped her slightly parted lips. She said it over and over under her breath, free, free, free. And at that point, she becomes light and bright. The terror leaves her body. Her body relaxes. We're on the other side of the storm now. So she's come in, and it's been wild and big and abandoned. And she's overcome with these dark clouds. But outside it comes in closer and closer and closer. And that springtime comes and overpowers the thunderstorm that was her spirit. And so she takes it in, and then she sees those last two sentences. She saw beyond that bitter moment a long procession of years to come that would belong to her absolutely. And she opened and spread her arms out to them in welcome. So she has now become the spring, because that's what happens in the spring, is that everything opens up and is welcomed. All the growth happens. She sees before her endless years that belong to her, that will be fresh in the way that the springtime was fresh. And so that's how one can analyze setting and characterization as they work together, as the setting impacts the characterization, and to create the meaning that's being asked for in the passage. And so that's another, turned out to be lecture on setting and characterization, but just another set of things to remember as you're reading your exam passage, another set of terms to keep in mind so that you have kind of the vocabulary of setting and characterization, and just a few things to think about. So think about when and where the passage is set and how that impacts the characters, whether you have predictions about how people should be acting throughout those, and then you have a prediction about whether or not there's any irony or eschewing of expectations. Are the characters being presented as those who struggle with the expectations, like in the prompt about Pickle and Pickle, or are they being characterized as people who are ready to break expectation, as in the story of an hour, or are they following expectations? Do they fit in exactly where you thought they might? So those are a couple ideas to take with you. Again, I don't know what the prompt will be, but if it's got anything to do with setting and characterization, then I hope that you remember these things. Thank you and good night.